The mare smelled her before I did. I was crossing the flat below the bluffs. Late afternoon, that hour when the light goes flat and bronze, and the shadows stretch long behind every stone, and the mare stopped. Threw her head once, nostrils working. I sat still and let her work, because she had never been wrong. Then I heard it. A sound like a snared rabbit makes when it's given up fighting and is only waiting. Low and wet, coming from the gully mouth, where the spring runoff had cut deep into the clay over the years and left a shelf of overhang and brown grass. I rode to the edge and looked down. She was on her back in the loose dirt, and she was not moving except for her chest, which was moving barely. Dress. White women's cloth, the kind that comes in bolts from the trading post, was torn in long strips across the back where she'd been laid, face down at some point, and under the strips, the skin was opened in welts that had gone past bleeding into something crusted and dark, some of them deep enough that I could see what a man is not supposed to see through the skin of another person's back. Face was turned to the side, one eye swollen shut, the other open and fixed on something that wasn't there. I sat on the mare for a moment, not because I was deciding. I'd already decided. I sat there because some things require a second of stillness before you move, a kind of acknowledgement that what comes next will change the shape of things, and you ought to know that going in. Then I got down. My name, in English, is Two Carries. That's the closest the traders ever got to it. What it means in my language is more particular than that. It refers to a man who has carried two kinds of loss and not buckled. But two carries is what the agents write in their ledgers, and what the soldiers call out when they want to speak with me. So I have made my peace with it. I was 53 years old that autumn. Chief of my band for 11 years by then, which meant I had buried men in war, and men in sickness, and had seen 7 hard winters and 3 floods, and 1 summer where the buffalo did not come at all and we ate dogs and old hide. I had a son grown, who rode with a warrior society to the south. I had lost my wife. Her name I keep to myself. To a fever 8 years before. I had not taken another woman. Not because the grief was still fresh, because the grief had gone dry and I had gotten used to the dryness, the way you get used to sleeping on one side of a bed so long that the other side starts to feel like it belongs to the air. I was not a soft man. I want to be clear about that. The men who rode with me knew what I asked of them, and they knew I would ask it without apology. I had cut horses, loose to die in a canyon to save the band's route. I had left a campsite before dawn, knowing there were men too sick to ride well, because the soldiers were 2 hours behind us, and I could not trade 30 lives for 4. A chief who keeps his people alive through 11 winters of this kind of life does not do it by being soft. But I was not a cruel man, and there is a difference. I crouched beside her in the gully, and I put 2 fingers to her throat and felt her pulse, which was there but thin, like a thread you're afraid to pull. I took the blanket from behind my saddle and laid it over her front because she was in shock, and the cold was coming. Then I put my hands under her, careful of the back, and I lifted her. She made a sound when I did, just air leaving. She didn't wake. I got her across the mare's neck, her front down over the horse's shoulder, so nothing pressed on the wounds, and I held her there with one hand and rode back to camp with the other. My camp that season was in the valley between 2 low ridges, 40 lodges, maybe 200 people. We'd been there since the summer hunt, and we'd stay until the first deep snow drove us to the winter grounds. It was a good camp. Wood and water both close. High ground on 2 sides so you could see trouble coming. When I rode in with a white woman, laid across my horse, there was a silence that moved through the camp like a wave. Women stopped what they were doing. Children pressed against their mothers. 3 of my warriors who'd been mending tack by the central fire came to their feet. My aunt, my father's sister, a woman of 70-something, who had outlived 2 husbands and 4 children, and who people were slightly afraid of, correctly, was already walking toward me before I'd stopped the mare. She looked at the woman on the horse. She looked at me. She said, In Lakota. How bad? I said. Bad enough. She said, bring her to my lodge. That was the end of the debate, which was good, because I hadn't been planning a debate. My aunt's name I will also keep. She had a healer's knowledge, plants and roots and methods that had come down through the women of our family for 3 generations. And she had a healer's bluntness, which meant she looked at things straight and did not perform distress about them. She cleaned the wounds with water she'd boiled with certain bark, dried and dark as tea. She made a poultice of things I knew by smell but not by name. She stitched the 2 cuts that needed it with sinew, working by firelight, close and unhurried. I sat outside the lodge and waited. I could hear sounds through the hide, my aunt's low murmur and once only, a sharp intake of breath from the woman that told me she'd surfaced far enough to feel what was being done to her, and then silence again. One of my warriors came and sat beside me without asking. His name was Stans Tall. He was 28. And he had been riding with me since he was 17. He had the habit of sitting close when things were uncertain, which I had come to value without ever saying so. He said, "Do you know whose woman she is?" I said, "No." He said, "The soldiers will come." I said. He was quiet a moment. Then, "And her man, if she has one?" I looked at the lodge flap. "The man who does that to a woman's back is not her man. He's something she survived." Stans Tall didn't argue with that. He was a sensible young man. She was unconscious for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, she was awake when my aunt brought her broth. My aunt came to find me after and said the woman had looked at the lodge walls and then at my aunt's face and had not screamed and had not tried to run, which my aunt considered the first good sign. She'd taken the broth, kept it down. I did not go in that day or the next. I sent my aunt with food and water and a change of cloth, and I waited, because I thought the most frightening thing in the world for a woman in that condition would be to open her eyes and find a man standing over her. On the 5th day, my aunt said, "She's asking who brought her." I said, "What did you tell her?" "The truth." I waited. I said my nephew found her and carried her in. My aunt looked at me in the dry, patient way she had. "She wants to see you." Her name was Clara. She told me that herself, sitting up in my aunt's lodge, with the blanket pulled to her collarbone and her good eye. The swelling had gone down enough that both were open now, steady on me in a way that took some courage, I thought, for someone in her position. She was younger than I'd have placed her at first. 25, maybe 26. Dark hair, pale where her skin wasn't bruised. A jaw that was set even when the rest of her face was tired. I sat down on the far side of the fire because the distance seemed right, she said. "You carried me." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" "Thought about it." I said, "Because you were there and you were alive. And those were the only reasons I needed." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands in her lap. "My husband will come for me," she said. Voice didn't change when she said it. Flat. Like telling me the direction of a road. "Your husband," I said. "Arranged," she said. "By my father. 3 years ago." She said it all level, without self-pity, just laying out the facts of a territory she'd been living in. "He is not a patient man." I said, "What is his name?" She told me. I didn't know the name then. I would come to know it. "When he comes," I said, "he will not take you." She looked up, that jaw setting a little tighter. "You can't promise that." "I can," I said. "I just did." She watched me. I did not look away. After a moment, something shifted in her face. Not relief, not yet. It was too soon for relief, but maybe the first distant sight of a shore she hadn't known was there. She said, "I don't know your name," I told her. She tried it, got close enough, nodded once, like she'd filed it somewhere that mattered. She healed slowly, the way deep things heal. The back was the worst of it. It would scar, my aunt said, and it did, though I would not see those scars for a long while yet. The ribs on her left side had 2 broken. Her wrist had been wrenched badly enough that it would ache in cold weather for the rest of her life. Were not the wounds a man inflicts in one night of anger. These were the accumulated record of years. She stayed in my aunt's lodge through the first week. The second week she began to move around the camp, quietly, staying close to the lodge. And the women of my band watched her with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity, and, from a few of them, practical sympathy that needed no translation. She had the sense not to crowd anyone. She helped with what she could reach, gathering wood when her ribs allowed it, mending, keeping the fire. She learned 3 or 4 words of Lakota and used them correctly, which the older women noticed and approved of, without saying so directly. I watched all of this from a careful distance, not because I was disinterested, because the worst thing a man in my position could do was make her feel watched after what she'd been through. But I thought about her, more than strictly the business of a chief. I told myself it was obligation. She was under my protection, and I was responsible for what happened to her. That was true. It was also not all of it. The husband came on a Thursday. I know it was Thursday because we had a trader in camp that week, a man named Golt, who kept his own calendar and said so when the riders appeared on the South Ridge. There were 4 of them. The husband and 3 men he'd hired, hard-looking, the kind of men who hire out for this kind of work and don't ask questions. The husband himself was thick-necked, red-faced, not tall but wide, with a way of sitting his horse that said he was used to being obeyed. I was already standing in the center of the camp when they rode in. My warriors were placed where they needed to be placed, not conspicuously, just present. Stan's Tall was to my left and slightly behind, 2 others near the lodge where Clara was. The husband pulled up his horse and looked at me and said, "I've come for my wife." I said, "She's not here," which was a lie, but it bought a breath. He said, "I have it on good authority she was brought to this camp." I said, "You have bad authority." His face went through a couple of colors. He looked around the camp, at the lodges, at the winged who had most drawn back, not entirely, at my warriors, positioned around us, like they weren't positioned at all. He was doing arithmetic. 3 hired men against however many he was counting. He said, "She's my wife by law." I said, "By what law?" "By United States law. By God's law." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about what I had seen in that gully, the strips of cloth, the open skin. I thought about her voice saying, "He is not a patient man." Flat and without self-pity. The voice of someone who had cataloged something for a long time. I said, "The woman you're describing is not here. If she were, I would tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. Go back. Don't come again." One of the hired men put his hand toward his holster. Stan's Tall shot the hat off his head. The man froze. The silence after that was complete. The husband's horse had shifted, and he'd brought it back under control. His face had gone from red to something closer to gray. He was looking at Stan's Tall, who was reloading with the kind of unhurried calm that is more frightening than urgency. I said, "You rode a long way. You should rest your horses before you ride back." Which was not an offer. It was instruction. They turned around. The man put his hat, rode a little lower over his horse's neck. They went back the way they came, and I watched them until they cleared the South Ridge and were gone. Behind me, I heard the tent flap. I didn't turn. I heard her footsteps in the dirt, and then she was beside me, Lanny, looking at the ridge where they'd disappeared. She said, "You knew I was watching." "Yes. Did you do that for me or for them?" "Both," I said. "Mostly for you." She was quiet. The camp was beginning to move again around us. The sounds of normal life resuming. Which is how you know a thing has passed. She stood close enough that I was aware of her arm near mine. Not tucked. Just near. She said, "He'll go to the soldiers." "Yes," I said. "He will. And then?" I looked at the ridge. "And then I'll deal with the soldiers." She looked at me then, and I looked at her, and she didn't say anything for a moment. What I saw in her face was something I was not going to put a name to yet. But I saw it. She said, "You should know. I have nowhere else to go. My father sided with my husband." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't want to be a burden to your people." I said, "You're not," she said. "You don't know that yet. You've only had me 2 weeks." "I know it." I said. Ask my aunt. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The first cousin of one. She looked back at the ridge. All right, she said. Just that, like a door settling on its frame. The soldiers came 10 days later. There were 12 of them. A lieutenant and 11 men, and they came in the late morning with the polite formality the army used when it wasn't sure of its ground. The lieutenant was young, 20-something, and he had a piece of paper that he showed me, which was a document of some kind attesting to the husband's legal claim. I looked at the paper. I said, I don't read English well enough to be certain what this says. The lieutenant began to read it aloud. I let him finish. Then I said, the woman you are describing is not a captive. She is here by her own choice. If you wish to ask her, I will bring her. The lieutenant hesitated. He had not been expecting that, I said. Or you can take my word. He chose to ask her, which was, I thought, the right instinct in a young man. Clara came out of my aunt's lodge and walked to where we were standing. She was wearing Lakota dress by then. My aunt had given her clothes when her own had fallen apart, and she stood straight despite what her ribs still cost her. She looked at the lieutenant and she said, very clearly, I am here because I chose to be. I am not returning with my husband. If he has a legal claim, he can bring it before the territorial court, and I will stand there and show the court my back, and we will see what the court makes of his legal claim. The lieutenant looked at her. He looked at me. He looked at the paper in his hand. He said, Ma'am, I have to advise you. She said, I know what you have to advise. Thank you. There was a silence. The lieutenant folded the paper. He was a decent young man, I thought, caught between a piece of paper and a woman's clear eyes and the arithmetic of what he was actually looking at. He said, I'll need to file a report. I said, you should. He turned his horse. His men followed. At the edge of the camp, he looked back once at me and gave a small nod. Not agreement exactly, more like acknowledgement, the kind one man gives another when there's nothing else honest to do. I gave it back. I never saw him again. The husband's legal claim, as far as I ever learned, went nowhere. Men who beat their wives the way he had beaten Clara are not at their best when they have to explain themselves in daylight, in front of other people. The winter was hard that year. They mostly were. We moved to the winter camp in early November. A valley in the hills, with good shelter from the north wind, where the band had camped for many winters before my time. The work of winter is the work of maintenance and survival. Keeping the lodges weather-tight, keeping the horses from starving, keeping the fire going, keeping the sick from dying, keeping the children from the cold. It is not dramatic work. It is relentless work. And the people who do it well are the people you want beside you when it matters. Clara did it well. She had a practical intelligence that showed itself in winter the way impractical people's doesn't. Not in bright moments, but in the steady accumulation of right small decisions. She learned to work hides. She was not good at it at first, but she was not proud about not being good, which meant she got better. She learned to read the weather in the quality of the light and the behavior of the horses, things the women had noticed for generations and had no name for in English. She kept close to my aunt, who was not an easy woman to keep close to, and who began, very gradually, to treat her with a shorthand that I recognized as respect. We were not, that winter, anything other than what I have described. She was under my protection. I was responsible for her. We spoke in the evening sometimes, she and I and my aunt, by the fire, and the conversations ranged in the way that winter conversations do when there is nowhere urgent to be, her life before the marriage, which she described plainly. A merchant's daughter in a city I knew only by name. My life before the chieftainship, the years of riding and fighting, my wife, which I spoke of briefly but honestly, question of what she would do when the spring came and the world opened back up. She said once, in February, when the snow was wall-high against the lodges and the wind had been running for 3 days, I haven't been afraid at night since I came here. I didn't say anything. She said I used to wake up every night, for years, listening, I looked at the fire. You don't have to listen here. She looked at me across the fire. Her face in that light. She said, I know. That was all. We were not people of many words, either of us. And the words we did use, we meant. In the spring, her color came back. I don't know how else to say it. Through the fall and the winter she had been. Recovered. Functional. Present. But there was a grayness under it all. Particular grayness. Of a person who has learned to expect the worst and has arranged themselves accordingly. In the spring, when the melt came, and the light changed and the first grass showed green, in the south-facing spots on the hillside, something in her shifted. She laughed one morning at something one of the young women said, a real laugh, quick and surprised, like she'd forgotten that was a thing she could do. I was crossing the camp when I heard it. I stopped. I stood there like a fool for a moment, just listening to the echo of it. I went to find Stan's Tall, I said. I need your advice. He looked at me with enormous caution. Chief? I said. Personal matter. His face settled into something respectful and carefully neutral. He was a sensible young man, as I said. I said, there is a way a man asks among our people. A question. You know the custom. He said yes. I said, is it? I stopped. Started again. I am 53 years old. She is 25 or 6. And she has come from. I stopped again. Stan's Tall said quietly, Chief, question is not whether it is strange. The question is whether it is true. I looked at him. He said, the rest is just weather. I went and found my aunt. She was outside her lodge, scraping a hide, working with the quick efficiency of 70 years of practice. She didn't look up when I sat down beside her. I said, I want to speak with her. My aunt said, still working. Took you long enough. I said, is it? Yes, my aunt said. I know what you're going to ask, and yes, she's not a fool and neither are you. Go and speak with her, I said. Do I say? My aunt stopped working and looked at me with an expression that I think she might have used on me when I was 8 years old, and no, smarter. Tell her the truth, she said. You know what the truth is. You've known since February. I found her by the creek at the edge of camp, where she'd taken to going in the late afternoons when the weather was warm enough. She was sitting on a flat rock with her feet in the water and her eyes on the current. And when I came, she didn't startle, told me she'd heard me coming, which was more than most people managed. I sat on the bank. For a minute, I just watched the water too. Then I said, I want to ask you something. She said, all right. I said, you know that in the spring when the pass is clear, a woman in your situation could go south. The trading posts, towns, you could make a life. You have the capability for it. She said yes. I said, I want to know if you would consider staying. She was quiet. The creek ran on. A red-winged blackbird landed on the far bank and left again. She said, why? I said, because I am asking. She looked at me. That's not an answer. No, I said, it's not. I looked at my hands. Shh. I was not practiced at this. 8 years of not being practiced at it. Because the winter was better with you in it. Because I have spent 53 years being responsible for other people. And I am not tired of that. But I had forgotten that a man can want something for himself. I had forgotten that was a thing a person was allowed. I stopped. Because when you laughed yesterday morning, I stood in the middle of the camp and listened to it like an idiot. She was very still. I said, I am not a young man. I am not an easy man. I have obligations that don't end. The life I can offer is, it is this, the camp, the work, the winters. I am not going to tell you it's simple, she said. I've had simple. Simple was a house in a city with a man who beat me for 5 years. I looked at her. She was looking at me steadily, that jaw set in the way it went when she was sure of something. She said, You carried me out of that gully when you could have ridden past. You sent men to the lodge, so he couldn't take me without going through them. You sat on the other side of the fire. Because you knew I needed the distance. She paused. Do you know how rare that is? A man who thinks about what a woman needs rather than what he wants from her. I didn't answer. She said, I know what I'm saying yes to. I've lived here 9 months. I know the winters. I know the work. She looked out at the water. I know you. She swung her feet out of the creek. She turned and looked at me, directly. Close enough now that I could see the old bruise on her cheekbone, faded to yellow and nearly gone, and the way her eyes held mine without flinching. "Ask me properly," she said. "The way your people ask." So I did. "We were married in the summer, by the custom of my people, which involves more ceremony than I am going to describe, because those things belong to us, and I'll keep them that way. My son rode 2 days to be there. He was cautious of her at first, which I understood, and then he ate her cooking, and she beat him at a gambling game my aunt had taught her, and he decided she was acceptable, which was his way of deciding he liked someone. By the end of his visit, he was teaching her words in Lakota she'd been too polite to ask my aunt. The husband, I never heard from him again. He thought better of it, or moved on, or simply decided the cost wasn't worth it. I can't say. I didn't spend much thought on it. A man who builds his life on cruelty is not, in the end, built to last. There is a thing that happens, I think, when a man has done the work his life required of him for long enough, honestly, and without complaint, and the right person arrives to see it, not to applaud it, just to see it, to know without being told what it cost, and to choose out of their own free will to put their hand in yours. That is not a small thing. I know men who lived and died without ever having that. I came close to being one of them. I have an image of her that I carry. Not the first sight of her in the gully. I carry that too, but not by choice. The one I carry by choice is later. A winter morning, early, maybe the second winter, when the frost was heavy on everything and the camp was quiet, and I came out of the lodge before dawn to check on the horses, and she followed me out without being asked, and we stood side by side in the cold and looked at the horses and looked at the stars going out, and she put her hand through my arm, not looking at me, just looking at the sky, and she leaned against my shoulder the small amount that she did, and I thought, this is what I was holding the line for. All those years. This. The stars went out, one by one. The horses breathed clouds in the cold. I stood there, with her weight against my arm, and I let myself have it. That's all. That's the whole of it.